Welcome to the Geekery in General podcast. I am your host, Al. Now, I know I did say I was going to be taking the month of August off, but I decided to record an episode. This is going to be a very impromptu and off-the-cuff episode, so I do apologize if I get a bit rambly and if I seem a little bit disorganized. Now, the name of this episode is 3D Printing for Fun and Profit. So if you're interested in 3D printing, but haven't quite made the investment yet, you're going to get the most use out of the first part of this episode. The second part of the episode, I'm going to be getting into some ways to actually make money with your 3D printing. I was inspired to do this episode after getting back from PhoenixCon, a local convention. Now, this convention started in 2001, and my wife and I have been there every year as vendors. My wife and I have also done a few other conventions as vendors, and my wife also does craft fairs and farmers markets to sell her products. So we do make money off of our 3D printing hobby. However, we don't quite make enough to quit our day jobs. Now, maybe if we went to more conventions, that might be possible someday, but for now, this is essentially a side hustle for both of us. Again, it's something we both enjoy doing, and it happens to make us some money along the way. Now, of course, I can't guarantee that this is going to make you lots of money because the nature of vending at a game convention is, I probably would say, fickle. It's very unpredictable, and we'll get into that later. But first, let's start out with the basics of 3D printing. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into this topic because, there's tons of YouTube videos out there about how to get started in 3D printing. So if you don't quite get the information you need from me in this episode, definitely go to YouTube and type in how to get started in 3D printing or 3D printing for dummies or 3D printing for beginners, and I'm sure you're going to find plenty of results that'll probably give you better information than I'm going to give here. So first, there are currently two major types of 3D printing: resin printing and filament printing. Resin printing, which is what I do, involves taking a liquid that cures when exposed to ultraviolet light and using it to print an object. And filament, which I do a little bit of, but my wife does more filament printing, is taking a spool of plastic material and it goes through the printer, it gets heated up, and then applied to a build plate. Actually, resin uses a build plate as well, but they actually are opposite in how they build up the object. When you're doing filament printing, it is building from, the ground up. Whereas, I guess you could say resin printing, you're technically printing from the ground up as well, but you're actually printing your model upside down because the build plate dips into the resin vat, makes contact with a screen of clear material called the FEP screen, gets exposed to ultraviolet light for a few seconds, comes up, goes back down. So whenever you're doing 3D printing, whether it's resin or filament, essentially what you're doing is you're building up a model layer by layer by layer. So this can actually take quite a bit of time depending on, the quality and speed of your printer, but also how thick of a layer that you're going to use. The smaller the layer height, the greater the detail is going to be, but the longer it's going to take for your model to print. However, if you use a thicker or a larger layer height, it's going to print a lot faster, but you're also not going to get as much detail. So each type of printing has several pros and cons to it. Now first, with filament printing, the pros are there's fewer safety concerns. It actually works quite well for gaming terrain, buildings, various knickknack items, and bigger items that actually have a utilitarian purpose. It also works not too badly for larger minis, but that sometimes requires you to play around with your printer settings a little bit, but it can work. Filament printed objects also tend to be a bit more durable, and another advantage is you can spot a failed print earlier on in the print job. So if you spot that failure early, you can stop the job and clear off your plate and then start over. Also, there are fewer startup costs. You need, of course, your printer, your spool. Most of 3D printers do require lubrication. Okay, on occasion. Occasionally, you do have to replace your extruder. And then you also need to get a product called bed weld. And this is a glue that you apply to the build plate of your printer, which allows the filament to stick to the plate so then it can start building those layers. Now, the cons of filament printing is the supports are harder to place. And in my opinion, they're harder to remove. However, to kind of counterbalance that, there are a lot of models that you can print on filament printers that do not require supports, or they may only require a very minimal amount of support. The details also tend not to be as sharp, and if you're doing something like a candy bowl, that's probably not a big deal, but if you like to print miniatures, then they're not going to look quite as good as a resin printed mini will. And also, in my opinion, there's a steeper learning curve. Now with resin, the pros are you're going to get better detail. I mentioned layer height before. I don't know the exact unit of measure they use, but for most filament printers, your layer height is 0.4. And it is possible to get a 0.2 nozzle. I'm not sure if they're at a 0.1 yet. But again, most printers are going to be between 0.2 and 0.4 for the layer height. Now compare that to a resin model or a resin printer. Most resin printers start out at 0.05. And usually if you want to get nice sharp detail, you can go down to a 0.02 or 0.01 for your layer height. So again, you can see just by the numbers there, smaller layer height, again, longer print time, but nicer details. The supports on a resin printed model are usually going to be much easier to remove. Resin printers are also better at printing multiple objects, especially if you're doing miniatures. Now, if you are printing a single miniature on a filament printer, that's usually going to be done a lot faster. But if you're printing, like let's say 4 miniatures at a time, that's going to take quite a bit longer on the filament printer because, well, it has to print the first layer of model 1, then do the first layer of model 2, then the first layer of model 3, and then the first layer of model 4. Then it goes back to model 1, prints, the second layer, and so on. Whereas with a resin printer, it prints all the layers at once. So again, in general, it's going to be a lot faster to print multiple miniatures at the same time. Also, how you place a mini in the supports, at least in my opinion, is a bit more forgiving. And this is what I mean by that. You always have to be careful with where you're placing the prints. You have to keep where you're placing you do have to watch out where you're placing your models and how you're placing them. But when you're placing your supports, you want to make sure that the supports are not running into any fine details, such as the face, or maybe if you have a character with a shield and there's a really cool design on the shield. So usually you want to place the supports where they're going to do the less amount of interference with the detail on the model. So usually that's going to be from underneath. Now, as far as placing supports, a lot of times companies that sell models, also known as STL files, they will offer you both a supported version, so they take care of that part for you, or they might also provide an unsupported one just in case, you want to place the supports by yourself. Now, resin printing does have a few downsides. First, it takes longer to tell if a print has failed. Because remember, with a resin printer, you're going down into a vat of liquid resin, and then you got to wait for it to come up. And usually by the time the build plate advances up high enough where you can actually see what's printing, usually it's going to be too late to tell if a model has failed printing or not. Also, most resin models are not as durable as filament printed models. Now, I know that there are resins out there that have more flexibility, but with that higher quality and that greater flexibility and that greater durability comes a higher price tag. There's also more safety concerns with resin printing, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Also, resin printing has higher startup costs. See, here's how the post-print process goes. Usually for a filament printed model, all you got to do is take it off of the build plate, and then if sometimes there's little strings of plastic that you'll see on your model, those are easy enough to remove. Usually if you hit it with a hot air gun or a hair dryer, that'll melt those away so it cleans up the model nicely. And if there's supports, of course you're going to have to remove them, and like I said, the supports on a filament model tend to be a lot more difficult to remove than those on a resin model. But once the cleanup's done, you're done. Usually you don't have anything else you need to do. Now, here's the post-print process with a resin model. First, you have to use a scraper to remove it from the build plate. After that, you have to clean off all the uncured resin. Usually this is going to involve using IPA or rubbing alcohol. So depending on your budget, that might mean just putting it in a cup full of resin and then swirling it around for several minutes until, the uncured resin is finally washed off. Or what some people do is they get a dunker where they put their models onto this like sieve, and then they dunk it up and down in a container of alcohol until the resin's all cleared off. And again, that can take a while. And then after you've cleared off the uncured resin, then you have to cure it in order to make it safe to handle with your bare skin. And in order to cure a resin model, you have to expose it to more ultraviolet light. There's a lot of ways you can do this. For example, you can leave it out in the sun, but that might take a couple hours. It's really going to depend on where you live and what the UV factor is and how sunny and how hot it is outside. Now, in my case, living in Wisconsin, most of the year that's not going to be a very practical solution. If you live closer to the equator or in an area where it's always warm and sunny, then that might be a bit more practical. Another way you can do it is by getting ultraviolet lights, but then you have to try to you have to shine that ultraviolet light on the model from all angles, and usually you want to, it's usually going to take several minutes to do that. Now, if you're thinking of doing a lot of 3D resin printing, you might want to do what I did, and that's invest in a washing and curing station. So this is a device that's about the size of a resin 3D printer. It has a vat, and then it also has a detachable circular plate. So what you do is, after you remove your models from the build plate, you put it in this cage, and then you put this cage into the vat full of rubbing alcohol. Then you put it on the wash and cure station, make sure it's set to wash mode, and then set a time. And then it uses magnets to agitate a plate at the bottom of the vat, which then agitates the rubbing alcohol. And usually 5 minutes is all you need to get the resin off there and get a nice clean looking print. Then you have to remove the vat, take out your minis, and then you put on that circular plate and then switch it to cure mode. And then what it does is you set your time limit, and it slowly rotates the mini. So this allows you to get the mini cured nice and evenly all around. And then what I always do is then I turn the mini to its side so I can cure the bottom of the base as well. So that's something I highly recommend if you want to invest in a nice, easy way to clean and cure your minis. Another disadvantage to resin printing is there's a higher startup cost and more extended costs. Because for starters, you have to have the rubbing alcohol to wash your minis in. And you can use that a few times, and then there is a way that you can drain some of the resin out so you can keep using it. And again, there's YouTube videos that explain how to recycle your resin, recycle your rubbing alcohol, but eventually you're going to have to probably replace it. So that's a cost you're going to have to worry about. You also have to have a cleaning product for that FEP screen I was telling you about. Because after you print, you're done with a print job, and if you're not going to be printing again for a while, you got to get all of the resin out of the vat and then clear off clean that off. So you're going to need like a streak-free, ammonia-free glass cleaner, and you're also going to need soft towels. Now, you don't want to use standard paper towels. That's too rough and that could scratch your screen. So instead, what you want to get are usually you can find them in the automotive section at most department stores and hardware stores. They're these soft blue towels. I've also heard Kleenex works really well as well. Now, the FEP screen I was telling you about, which is what separates your LCD screen and the ultraviolet light from the resin, those wear out eventually. So they do get a little bit of scuff, or they get scuffed up a little bit no matter what you do. So you're going to have to replace those every now and then. So you're going to have those FEP screens. And those can be a pain in the butt to replace depending on your vat and how many screws you have to remove. Another thing you're going to go through a lot of are examination gloves. So I think they're made of nitrine or I forgot the exact wording, but basically they're the gloves like your doctor would use if they're going to give you an examination. So you're going to be going through a lot of those because you don't want to reuse them. Basically, after you use them, you want to dispose of them. But the biggest con or downside of resin printing are the safety concerns. Now, I mentioned before, filament has fewer safety concerns. The biggest thing to consider is the type of filament that you're printing with. The two most popular are PLA and PETG. Now, according to every website I've consulted on the matter, both are considered generally safe. So you shouldn't have any problems using them, but I think they probably just put that verbiage in there because widespread 3D printing as a hobby is still fairly young, I guess. It's only been around for a few years. I don't know exactly how long, but there might not be a lot of long-term data on the safety effects of being exposed to this type of printing. Because as you're melting this filament, it does give off some fumes and particles. Now, the websites I looked at said that it can cause eye and respiratory irritation and problems for some sensitive individuals. So you do want to make sure you're using it in a well-ventilated area. Better yet, you want to get an enclosure. Now, a lot of high-end commercial 3D printers actually come in their own enclosure. My wife, the 3D printers she uses are all enclosed. Also, I think hers also have filters as well, so that we haven't had any problems with eye or respiratory irritation when using those printers. Now, if you're using one that isn't enclosed, then you might want to consider getting an enclosure for it, or putting it somewhere in like a basement or your garage, or if you have like a screened-in patio or porch. Those might be better places just to be on the safe side. Now, I know with both resin and filament printers, they usually work best at room temperature. So putting them on like a screened-in porch or patio may only be effective for part of the year. Because if it's too cold or even too hot, you're likely to have problems with your prints. But again, generally, those are the main safety concerns. Also, the build plate and the bed of a filament printer does tend to get quite hot. So you want to make sure that you're not burning yourself. Resin, on the other hand, some of it can have some pretty nasty fumes. And so you do have to worry about those fumes. You have to worry about those particles during the printing process. It's a skin and eye irritant. Obviously, you don't want to get this stuff in your mouth or inside your nose or your eyes. So when you are using a resin printer and you're handling the resin, that's why you want those gloves. Also, you want to have a mask or a respirator and safety glasses so you don't get any of that stuff in your eyes, mouth, or nose. Also, when you're removing the supports from the model, you generally want to keep your mask and your goggles on, because sometimes when you're removing those supports, they can fly off. So you want to make sure you don't accidentally get one in your mouth or your eye. You also have to be careful with how you dispose of it, both the resin and the used rubbing alcohol. So that might differ depending on where you are and what your local regulations are, but you don't want to just pour them in the grass outside your house. Now, there are some safety precautions you can take for the fumes and the particles that can be released by resin printing. First, if the fumes are bothering you, you can use plant-based resin. That's what I use. It's very, very low odor, and it's a little bit safer for the environment. But again, you still have to take precaution in how you dispose of it. Now, some printers do actually have a built-in filter. And if yours does not, fortunately, there are small battery-powered filters that you can get. You just put them inside of your printer, turn them on, and then it'll help remove some of the, that odor and these particles that are released during the printing process. The only downside is they do have a charcoal filter, which you do need to replace every so often. Again, if it's really going to depend on how often you use it. So if, you do a lot of printing, you're printing almost every day, you're going to want to replace it on a more frequent basis than if you're only printing like maybe a few times a month. Perhaps the most important safety concern when you're using a resin printer is where you're putting it. You do not want to put this in your bedroom or in like your kitchen or your living room or anywhere where people are going to be. Ideally, you want to put it in like a basement or a garage, someplace that you don't have to be in while it's printing, and preferably someplace with good ventilation. I mean, I know I've got a window in my basement where I put my printer, so if I'm going to be working down there, I'll open up the window to get some fresh air in and, help get some of the particles and the fumes out. So those are some of the pros and cons of resin printers and filament printers. If you still are interested in getting involved in this hobby, then you want to, do a little more research, go to different website forums. There's lots of 3D printing groups on Facebook. Certainly ask. I'm sure people are going to be happy to tell you their experiences and give you their input. And as I mentioned before, go to YouTube, look up 3D printing for beginners. You'll find a lot of information. Now we get to the part about printing for profit. Now, even if you are just printing for fun, though, you need models, STL files. Fortunately, there are a lot of places you can get them for free. There are sites like Cults 3D and Thingiverse. They have a lot of free STL models that you can download for printing. However, you have to pay attention to the licensing on those models, or whether you get it from one of those sites or any site you get it from. There's a lot of models out there that are for personal, non-commercial use only. So if you are planning on selling these models, then you're going to have to pay very close attention to the licensing terms on the files that you download. So if you are looking for models that you can sell, I'm going to give you some places that my wife and I use. Now, one place you can look is My Mini Factory. It's a good site because they have a wide variety of models that you can download. There's a lot of them that you can purchase, and they'll tell you if you're purchasing a non-commercial license, or there are vendors on that site that do offer a commercial license for some of their prints. So, like I said, just to avoid any legal problems, pay close attention to the licensing terms on anything you download. Another site that my wife and I use is STL Flicks. Now, they have weekly drops. A lot of their stuff tends to be more like knickknacks and household items. They do offer miniatures. They haven't offered as many lately because, they actually went through a long period where they weren't doing miniatures. And that's because they didn't renew the contract with the studios they were working with. But they recently started getting back into offering miniatures for printing. Now, STL Flicks does offer both commercial and non-commercial licenses. So if you just want to download stuff to print for personal use, you can get a subscription for that. If you want to sell, then you can get a commercial subscription. Now, my wife and I were lucky because we got in when the site was still young, so we were able to get a lifetime merchant's license with STL Flicks. So, yeah, it cost us a pretty penny, but it was worth it. We've definitely more than made up for it, but they don't really do it as much anymore. I think they still do it on Black Friday, but they don't offer it the same rate that they did when we first got that license. Now, if you want to print custom miniatures, there's a lot of sites you can go to for that. The main ones are Titancraft, Hero Forge, and Eldritch Foundry. Now, I don't have much experience with Eldritch Foundry. I use Titancraft. Now, the nice thing about Titancraft is they give you a limited number of assets that you can use for free for personal use. Then they have asset packs. These come in various themes like Wild West, modern, science fiction, fantasy, steampunk. And what's nice about their business model is once you download an asset pack, you can use it as much as you want. They also offer merchant's license. So that's what I did. I purchased a merchant's license from them, and that unlocks all the assets. So I can use anything that they release, and I can sell the prints that I make. And if I decide to let my merchant's license expire, I can still use the models I downloaded. I just can't use them for commercial purposes, but I can still print them out for my own personal use. So that's kind of nice. Probably the most popular one is Hero Forge. I have a little experience with it. You can do some neat things with their site and their editor. I'm part of a Hero Forge group on Facebook, and it's amazing to see some of the models that people make with the Hero Forge website. Now, I have heard, though, that their licensing is pretty strict. Now, they do not offer a commercial license, at least not the last time I checked. If you just want to make some cool minis to download for your own personal use and for your campaign, then feel free to use them. However, just be aware that they pay per download. So I'm not sure how many edits you get, but once you've downloaded a file from them that you've created, then you're stuck with what was on that model. So let's say a couple months later, they release a cooler looking sword and you want to use that one for your character. At least as far as I know, you would have to re-download and pay for a new model, even though you're just changing the sword. I did see a channel on YouTube a while ago. I think it was called Elite RPG. And the host of that channel was talking about how another thing you have to be careful about is if, let's say, you want to use Hero Forge to create a model of a hero and then give that to an artist friend and have them use it for, a print or something for a product you're developing. Well, since you are using their assets for inspiration, at least the way he understood their terms of agreement, that meant that Hero Forge would own the likeness there because you based it off of their copyrighted protected material. That may have changed. I don't know. Like I said, I really don't do anything with Hero Forge. But if you are looking for minis you can make and you can sell, then definitely go with Titancraft. They are also going to be releasing a sister site that is going to be for mech vehicles. I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure if that's been released yet, though. But I did ask one of the creators if the merchant's license for Titancraft is going to apply for that site, and he said that probably not. So if you wanted to sell models of mechs, you're probably going to have to get a separate merchant's license for that site. So now that you know where to get models, let's talk about selling them at conventions. Now, ever since my wife and I started doing conventions, selling 3D printed stuff, we've done well. Like I said, we haven't made enough to quit our day jobs, but we've made back the cost of our booth. And for conventions where we've had to travel out of town and get a hotel room, we've managed to make back those costs and still have profit left over. So hopefully you find some of the advice I give helpful if you choose to try to do that as well. Biggest piece of advice I think I can give is pay attention to what other 3D vendors are offering. At least in my state, I've noticed that there are several vendors that do the convention circuit. So, you see them quite frequently, several times a year. So get to know what they offer so you can find a way to stand out. At least at the conventions we've been to, I have not seen anyone else offering resin printed minis or even the filament printed minis. Most of the vendors I've seen tend to be offering dice towers and articulated dragons and animals and more knick-knacky type things. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with printing those items. But I would advise you to have a diverse product offering. Don't focus solely on articulated dragons and dice towers. Now, I have a feeling that the reason they're popular is because usually those can be printed without supports. So it's nice and easy. Just put the model into your slicing program, send it to your printer, and print away, and then when it's done, take it off the plate, start a new one. Okay, so I just mentioned a slicing program. I probably should have mentioned this earlier. Like I said before, this is off the cuff, so it's a little disorganized. But basically a slicing program, I mean, you might remember how I talked about layers. A slicing program is a program that you use to add supports to your model if they're needed, and then it slices the model into layers and then turns that into a file that you can send to your printer so it'll know what to print on each layer and give you a nice 3D print. Don't go overboard with dice towers and articulated animals. Everyone with a 3D printer does them. My wife and I, we've actually stopped really bringing a lot of those to the game conventions. We'll bring a handful of them. But what we do to differentiate our product from competitors is we will try to paint the dice towers, and we'll also do a little bit of painting details on the articulated animals just to make them stand out a little bit. I would also say don't overlook the value of these small items. It's a good impulse buy. I mean, not everyone is going to want to buy a $20 or $30 dice tower, but, you know, a little articulated animal or a little, you know, trinket box or a little other knickknack thing for like $5, yeah, a lot of people like buying them, and trust me, those sales add up. Now, one of the things my wife and I have gotten into in the last couple years is we've started doing more terrain and buildings. Now, also what we do to differentiate ours from our competitors, well, actually, I haven't seen a lot of people doing terrains and buildings. I think I've only seen one other vendor doing those items. But my wife actually goes all out and she paints them. So we, you know, sell it for a good price. And actually, I remember we've had people tell my wife she could probably be selling them for a lot more, which is true. But our philosophy is price to move. Like at our last convention, Phoenix Con, my wife made this big pirate ship and she painted it. And it did sell. We were only charging about $140 for it. We probably could have charged about $200 or $250 for it. So yeah, we would have made a lot more money and she would have made more back for the time she spent painting this thing. But if we priced it too high, well, that's going to limit the number of people who might actually buy it. Now, this does bring up the question, how much should you charge for your prints? I've heard several different camps and several different takes on this theory, but the general rule of thumb is $1 per hour of print time plus the cost of your materials. So if you have a model that takes 10 hours to print and it uses $1 worth of material, then charge $11 at the very minimum. Now, honestly, I think it really kind of depends on your audience. People usually like cheaper things, which is another reason that we don't charge as much as we could for the buildings that my wife likes to print out and paint. But as I said before, our philosophy is price to move. Trust me, we're in this to make money, not just print out things for people to look at, say, oh, that looks nice, and then walk on to the next vendor booth. So I would recommend having maybe 2 or 3 big ticket items. But one of the reasons we didn't do multiple boats Just use that pirate ship as an example. Well, first of all, it would take a lot longer, but also if there were multiple boats out there, well, then someone looking at it and who's thinking of buying it might think to themselves, it'll be there later when I get back. But if they know that there's only one of them, well, then they have to decide, do I want to purchase it now? Or do I want to, wait and come back later? And trust me, after it was sold, we did have a couple people come back later and were like, oh, I was actually thinking of buying that. So yes, it does happen. Another thing that's important is how you're going to physically set up your booth. Now, this can be tricky because most conventions, the average booth space is either 10 by 10 or 8 by 10. I think was at one con where it was like 8 by 8. So you don't get a lot of space. So what my wife and I do is we always get 2 booths. So again, that's going to increase our cost, but we've been fortunate that we've made enough money to cover that cost. So it's very important to organize your booth in a way where you're putting your big ticket items up front. I generally don't recommend burying them in the back. You also want to make it look nice because if you only get one booth and it gets too crowded, it's just going to look like a bunch of stuff sitting around on a table and people are going to have problems getting in and taking a look at your wares. We actually had an experience with the vendor next to us. They were also doing 3D printing, and I was talking to the guy who was running that booth. Now, he actually set up after we were done and we weren't there, but when he was setting up, he noticed that we did 3D printing. And at first, he was a little discouraged. It's like, oh, they put me next to another 3D printer. But then he looked at the stuff we offered and realized that he had some stuff that was different from ours, so he wasn't as worried. But for the first day of the con, they really weren't selling much. So my wife actually gave them some advice on how to rearrange their booth to bring some of their stuff up to the front. After that, they did much better. So that's another thing when you start getting into the convention circuit. If you're attending multiple conventions per year, you're going to start to see the same faces. So always try to make good with the people around you, because you never know when you're going to need them for a favor. You want to have people you can trust in case, you got to run to the bathroom and you want someone to keep an eye on your booth for a few minutes. Plus, a lot of the people who vend at these conventions are legitimately nice people. In all the years we've been doing this, we only encountered one person who was, well, he wasn't a jerk, but he was kind of creepy, and he complained a lot about the fact that he wasn't making a lot of sales. But like I said, I wouldn't say he was a bad person, just kind of creepy and kind of negative attitude. Another thing that we do is as we start to sell our merchandise, then if there's no one around, we'll start to reorganize stuff just to help keep a little neater and try to fill in any of the empty space. And we've always found that approach worked really well for us. Another important tip is know your audience. My wife does craft fairs and farmer markets in addition to gaming conventions. So obviously she's dealing with a much different crowd there. So she's not going to bring dice towers, and I'm not going to have her try to sell some of my minis at one of those places because it's probably not going to do as well. Well, that is actually one nice thing, though, about the articulated dragons and animals people like printing. You can sell those at pretty much any convention, especially the dragons. Like I said, people seem to like them. But on the other hand, there's some stuff that she prints out that she's generally not going to bring to a game convention. For example, she has earrings that she prints out. So while those do sell at craft fairs and farmers markets, we're probably not going to get as many sales of those at a gaming convention, so that would just be a waste of space. So there you have it, a quick look at 3D printing and how you might make a little bit of money with this hobby. You have been listening to a presentation of Point of Insanity Game Studio. Visit us on the web at www.poigamestudio.com. Follow me on most social media sites at POI Game Studio. And check out my music channel on YouTube at Al Seeger Music.